The first book, Julian, placed in the box, was the one Willa asked him to read whenever thunder kept her awake. The second was the picture atlas, with the cracked spine he had repaired 3 times. By the fourth book, I understood my son was not cleaning his little sister's room. He was preparing her to live without him. I said his name quietly. Julian. He froze on the carpet beside Willa's bed. A roll of book tape rested near his knee, and pale index cards protruded from the covers. She likes this one when the rain gets loud. Do not skip the page with the fox. Dad used to make the owl voice. The house had been quiet since Peter's funeral, but this was a different kind of quiet. This one had labels, instructions, and a plan. Why are you packing her books? Julian pressed both palms against the top one. If she goes to Grandma's, she should have the things she knows. No one has decided she is going anywhere. They're going to keep fighting. That is not your responsibility. Uncle Gavin said the case could cost enough to make us sell the house. My chest tightened. When did Gavin discuss our finances with you? He stared at the box. I lowered myself to the floor. Why are you teaching them how to comfort your sister? His breathing changed before his expression did. Because they won't know how. Then she should not live with them. For 1 second, hope reached his face. Then shame pushed it away. She'll be safer with them. Safer from what? His fingers curled around the cardboard. From losing everything because of me. Later that night, Julian sent Gavin a photograph of the box. Under it, he wrote, I think she'll be safer with Grandma. That message followed us into court. At the June hearing on Peter's will, and my appointment as executor, Lorraine's attorney displayed the photograph on a screen. Every book was visible. So were Julian's instructions. Mrs. Keller may dislike the conclusion, he told Judge Ellis, but her own adopted son understood that Willa needed a more stable home. No one forced him to prepare this transition. Across the aisle, my mother-in-law lowered her eyes, as if my son's surrender had injured her. Gavin sat beside her, with a binder containing his objection to my appointment. Julian was not in the courtroom. I had refused to make a 15-year-old watch adults debate whether his fear counted as consent. Lorraine's attorney introduced a 47-second recording Peter had made during his final month. He smiled when the screen lit. My husband looked thin beneath the hospice blanket. A sheet of handwritten notes trembled in his left hand. If something happens to me, Peter said, Willa must be protected. She will be the most vulnerable one. The clip stopped. Peter Keller knew his biological daughter needed protection, the attorney said. The proposed executor concealed that instruction and rejected the relatives prepared to carry it out. My lawyer stood. Your Honor, the recording session lasted 11 minutes and 32 seconds. Both sides received the certified file. Petitioners are asking the court to hear the middle of an answer without the question or explanation. Judge Ellis looked at Peter's frozen image, denied the request to exclude the rest, and directed the clerk to play the complete answer. Peter appeared again. This time, the video began several minutes earlier. He looked down at the notes he had prepared, closed his eyes, and took a breath. Before anyone decides where Willa belongs, he said, I need to admit what I taught Julian by refusing to confront my own family. Lorraine's attorney stopped smiling. To understand why that sentence changed the room, you need to know what Peter's family called our son 3 weeks after we buried him, and why Julian believed disappearing was the kindest thing he could do. Before I take you back to the beginning, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me to hear what happened next, and please subscribe to the channel if stories about family, dignity, and second chances matter to you. 3 weeks after Peter's funeral, I woke before my alarm and found the kitchen light already on. Julian stood at the counter spreading peanut butter across 2 pieces of toast. Willa's water bottle was full beside him. Her rescue inhaler sat in the front pocket of her backpack, and the dead bulb in the hallway had somehow been replaced overnight. You were supposed to sleep, I said. He told me he had slept, then slid Willa's plate toward her usual seat. You were also supposed to let me make breakfast. It was only toast. That sentence had become Julian's answer to everything. It was only toast. It was only a light bulb. It was only one more thing he could carry before anyone noticed he was tired. I pointed to the chair. Sit down and eat. I'm not hungry enough yet. As he bent to tie his shoes, I saw him loosen the laces until the sides barely touched. I asked whether the shoes were hurting him. He straightened too quickly and said they still fit. Willa came in, dragging her backpack by one strap. She looked at Peter's empty chair, then turned to her brother. Are you reading tonight? Of course I am. She nodded, satisfied, and climbed into her seat. An hour later, Lorraine called. She wanted us at her house for lunch to discuss what she called Peter's unfinished family matters. Every part of me wanted to refuse, but Willa had already lost her father. I was not ready to make her lose her grandmother in the same month. Lorraine's dining room looked less like a home than a memorial exhibit. Photographs of Peter stretched across a side table from infancy through college. Beside them stood 3 recent pictures of Willa. There was not one photograph of Julian. Willa noticed before I did. She walked to the table and pointed at a picture of Peter at 8 years old. Where's Julian? Lorraine adjusted a silver frame. This is the Keller family line, sweetheart. These are people born into your father's family. Julian's face did not move. He had become very good at making pain look like politeness. Gavin cleared his throat and said Willa should begin staying with Lorraine several nights each week. He framed it as help, not a demand. I could focus on Julian's special needs, he explained, while Willa received routine, family history, and stability. My children need each other, I told him. They are not being divided into separate problems for adults to solve. Lorraine folded her napkin with slow, careful movements. Willa should not lose the stability of Peter's family because you are carrying someone else's child. The room went still. Julian lowered his eyes to his plate. Willa looked from her grandmother to me, waiting to understand what she had just heard. I placed my hand flat on the table. Julian is my son, Peter's son, and Willa's brother. If you erase him from this family again, this visit ends. Biology is not an insult, Lorraine replied. No, but using it to decide which child belongs is. I stood, told both children to get their coats and walked out before dessert was served. The gar? Willa slid across the back seat until her shoulder touched Julian's. He stared through the window and told her grandma was only sad. Even then, he was protecting the person who had just rejected him. That evening, Dana Pike called to tell me Peter's original will had been filed, and Gavin had submitted an objection to my appointment as executor. Before I could ask what possible grounds he had, the doorbell rang. A process server handed me another packet. Lorraine had petitioned to remove me as Willa's guardian and requested temporary custody while the case was pending. The petition did not deny that Julian was Peter's legally adopted son. It did something colder. It described his presence in our home as a source of emotional instability for Willa. They were not claiming he was unrelated on paper. They were preparing to argue that being my son made him dangerous to his sister. Dana spread the 2 sets of papers across her desk the next morning and placed a yellow legal pad between them. These are not the same case, she said. Gavin's objection concerns Peter's estate and whether you should be appointed executor. Lorraine's petition concerns your legal authority over Willa. I looked at the pages again. They had arrived within minutes of each other, written in the same careful language, and felt like one coordinated attempt to take apart everything Peter and I had built. Can she really take my daughter because she is Peter's mother? No. Dana tapped the second packet. They cannot take Willa because they share blood. They must prove you denied her the care, guidance, or control necessary for her well-being. The words should have reassured me. Instead, I thought of every mistake I had made during Peter's final months. Dana began reading the allegations without adding drama to them. Willa had missed 6 school days. She had arrived late 4 times. The authorization form allowing the school nurse to administer her rescue inhaler had been renewed 9 days after the previous form expired. Julian had collected her from the bus, prepared snacks, and reminded her about medication. I had reduced my work schedule, and on one afternoon, when our regular sitter canceled, I had left Willa with her 15-year-old brother for 75 minutes. They make it sound like I disappeared, I said. That is what petitions do when someone arranges facts around a conclusion. I explained that the absences occurred while Peter was in hospice, and during the week of his funeral, Willa had still had a valid inhaler at home. The pediatrician's office had delayed returning the school form, and I had followed up twice. The afternoon Julian watched her, I had left work early and driven straight home. Dana wrote without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Their case is weak on the law. It becomes dangerous only if they can make a frightened child's surrender look like an informed choice." I remembered Julian staring at the petition the previous night. What surrender? I don't know yet. But they are already describing him as the reason Willa lacks stability. If he begins agreeing with them, they will use it. She told me what we would do next. All communication from Lorraine and Gavin would go through council. I would request complete attendance records from the school, including the dates and explanations. Willa's pediatrician would document that her asthma had remained properly managed. Every text, email, and voicemail would be saved. Julian would begin seeing a therapist experienced with grief and adoption trauma. None of it sounded heroic. It sounded like folders, phone calls, and signatures. But each task gave me something solid to hold. Dana closed the petition. Do not interrogate Julian. Do not ask him to defend himself. Tell both children enough that they are not inventing something worse in the silence. That evening, I brought them to the kitchen table. Peter's chair remained pushed in. I had stopped avoiding it, but none of us used it. Grandma Lorraine has asked the court to let Willa live with her while a judge decides whether I should continue making decisions for her, I said. Willa's fingers tightened around her cup. For how long? I don't know. The judge may say no. Is Julian going too? No. She looked at her brother. Why not? Julian kept his eyes on the table. Because Grandma's request is only about you, I said. But no one is dividing this family without me fighting the facts. I did not promise that nothing would change. Dana had warned me not to offer certainty I could not control. I told them we had a lawyer, that they had done nothing wrong, and that neither of them needed to solve an adult case. Julian's first question was not whether Lorraine could win. How much does the lawyer cost? That is my responsibility. If it takes months, does it cost more? Julian, I'm only asking. Then I'm answering. You do not need to calculate this. He glanced toward the hallway, as if he could already see a real estate sign outside. Would we have to sell the house? The question landed differently from the one about fees. It was too specific and too frightened. Who told you that? No one. Lawyers cost a lot. Houses cost a lot. I can do math. You do not know our mortgage, our insurance, or what Peter left behind. I know you reduced your hours. I reached across the table, but he moved his hand to his lap before I could touch it. Whatever happens with the house, I said, it will not be because of you. He nodded in the way people nod when they want a conversation to end, not when they believe what they have heard. The temporary custody hearing took place 16 days later. Judge Ward did not allow anyone to turn the room into a family argument. Lorraine's attorney described Willa as a child caught between a grieving mother and a traumatized teenager. Dana answered with school records, medical notes, and the fact that no teacher, physician, or counselor had reported that Willa was unsafe. Lorraine spoke softly when the judge allowed her to answer a question. I am not trying to replace Naomi. I am asking for temporary stability while she recovers. I watched her say it without looking at Julian, who sat outside the courtroom with a courthouse family services worker. She had learned to remove him from sentences before she tried to remove him from our home. Judge Ward denied temporary custody. She said the evidence did not show an immediate risk requiring Willa to be taken from me. Relief moved through my body so quickly that I had to grip the edge of the table. Then the judge continued. The underlying petition to remove me as Willa's guardian would remain open. The court would appoint an attorney for Willa, request an independent child welfare investigation, and schedule a full hearing after the reports were completed. Lorraine had not been given my daughter, but she had been given more time to argue that I should lose her. Outside the courtroom, Gavin spoke quietly to his mother while their attorney packed his files. Lorraine looked at me and said, "This could have been avoided if you had accepted temporary help." Temporary help does not begin with a petition to remove a mother. Her expression hardened for only a moment. "You are forcing Willa to endure this." Dana touched my arm before I answered. She did not need to say anything. Lorraine wanted a reaction she could describe later as instability. I walked away. Julian waited near the elevators. He stood when he saw me and searched my face. "Did she get Willa?" "No." The judge denied temporary custody. His shoulders dropped, but only slightly. "The case isn't over, is it?" "No." We stepped into the elevator. Dana and Willa followed, and the doors closed on Lorraine's family. Julian stared at the changing floor numbers. If I wasn't there, would they drop it? I turned toward him. "Your absence is not a settlement." He looked down. "I'm serious. You are not a condition I negotiate away so someone else will leave your sister alone." He said nothing for the rest of the ride. At home, Willa followed me into the kitchen while Julian went upstairs. She waited until we heard his bedroom door close. "Mom? What is it?" He was looking at schools. I stopped setting my bag on the counter. "What schools?" "The ones where you sleep there. He said they have counselors and workshops." "Boarding schools?" She nodded. "He told me not to worry because he was only checking." Above us, a floorboard creaked in Julian's room. The court had refused to take Willa from me that morning. But somewhere inside my son, Lorraine and Gavin had already planted the idea that the easiest way to save our family was for him to leave it. 2 days after Willa told me about the boarding schools, I found blood on the back of Julian's sock. It was not much, only a thin red line above his heel, but it ended the argument he had been having with me for weeks. "We're buying shoes," I said. "These still work. They are cutting your feet." I tied them wrong. "You have been tying your own shoes since kindergarten." He looked toward the stairs, checking whether Willa could hear us. "Can we not make this a thing?" That was another expression Julian used whenever one of his needs threatened to take up space. A thing meant money, attention, or an inconvenience someone might later remember. At the shoe store, he tried to place his foot directly into a pair without letting the employee measure him. She stopped him gently and asked him to stand on the metal device. "These are 2 sizes larger than what you came in wearing," she said after measuring both feet. Julian looked at the floor. I didn't notice. The red marks around his heels said otherwise. He chose the least expensive pair from the clearance shelf. When he walked across the carpet, his toes pressed against the front. "They're fine," he said. The employee glanced at me, but did not challenge him. I asked her to bring the properly fitted pair he had looked at before checking the price. Julian watched her walk away and lowered his voice. "They cost $40 more." "I know. The other ones are usable. They do not fit. I can stretch them." "No." His jaw tightened. "I could help at your center for a few afternoons. I could clean storage rooms or organize supplies. You are not paying me back for shoes." "I'm not trying to pay you back. I'm offering to help." "You offered the moment you saw the price difference." The employee returned. Julian put on the new pair and took 3 careful steps. His shoulders relaxed before he remembered to hide it. I knelt and pressed my thumb against the space above his toes. "These are the ones." On the drive home, he stared out the window. "Parents do not sell necessities to their children," I said. He gave me a faint smile. "I know." But he said it the same way he had nodded when I told him the house was not his fault. He understood the sentence. He did not believe it applied to him. Once I began looking, I could not stop seeing the pattern. The summer before, he had insisted he no longer wanted to attend the art camp he had talked about for months. I accepted his explanation until I found the registration page open on the family computer. scrolled to the tuition section. On his 13th birthday, he left 2 gifts unopened because the receipts were taped beneath the wrapping paper. He claimed he wanted to save them for later. Peter eventually found him placing both boxes near the front door, so they would be easier to return. When the orthodontist recommended braces, Julian apologized in the parking lot before we even received the cost estimate. I had treated each moment as a separate expression of anxiety. Peter and I reassured him, bought what he needed, and moved on. We never asked why being cared for made him feel accused. The answer had been spoken around him for years. At one Christmas dinner, Lorraine had watched him clear the table and said, "At least Julian understands what he owes." Peter had frowned, but only told her not to phrase it that way. Later, when Julian asked what she meant, Peter told him to ignore her. I had put my arm around him and said, "You know you're ours." At the time, I thought I was protecting him. Looking back, I had asked a child to carry the insult quietly so the adults could keep dessert pleasant. That evening, I made pasta and placed 3 bowls on the counter. "Everyone chooses one thing," I said. "Sauce, vegetable, or dessert. One choice each." Willa immediately requested garlic bread. Julian opened the refrigerator. "Whatever she wants is fine." "She chose bread. You choose something else." "I don't care." "Then choose something you dislike least." He studied the shelves, as if I had given him a test, with no correct answer. "We already have enough food." That was not the question. Willa came into the kitchen holding one of her picture books. The cover hung loose from the binding. "Julian, can you fix this?" He took it from her immediately. "You pulled the tape too hard last time." "I didn't pull it, the book did." Books rarely destroy themselves. She followed him to the table, protesting, while he found the repair tape in the drawer. Within seconds, my question had disappeared beneath a task he knew how to perform. Julian could identify what his sister needed before she finished asking. Give him a choice for himself, and he became lost. My phone vibrated while he worked. Dana had forwarded an email Gavin's attorney submitted with the latest estate papers. Most of it concerned Peter's will. One sentence stopped me. "Julian has maturely acknowledged the financial burden Naomi's decisions are placing on Willa and the extended family." I read it again. Only 4 people had been in my kitchen when Julian asked about legal costs. Gavin was not one of them. I looked at Willa. She was watching her brother smooth tape along the book's spine. "Sweetheart, when you went for ice cream with Grandma, did Uncle Gavin talk to Julian alone?" She thought for a moment. "Grandma took me to wash chocolate off my shirt. Uncle Gavin stayed at the table with him." "How long?" "I don't know. He bought me another scoop after." Julian's hand stopped moving. I set my phone down. "What did Gavin say to you?" "Nothing important. He told his attorney that you understand the financial burden of my decisions. He was explaining things." "What things? What could happen?" His voice was quiet, but the phrase sounded rehearsed. "What did he say could happen?" "He said the case might take months. He said lawyers charge for every call and every paper. He said if the court thought Willa needed stability, they might look at everything that makes the house unstable." "Did he say you made the house unstable?" "No." "Did he imply it?" Julian pressed the loose edge of tape down with his thumbnail. "He said courts remove variables when families cannot agree." My throat tightened. "Variables?" "He didn't call me one directly." "You just called yourself one." His expression changed. Not surprise, exactly. More like the realization that he had repeated something he had meant to keep hidden. "He said there were parts of the situation the court could remove," Julian said. "I'm the only part that isn't Willa's mother or biological family. You are her legal brother. I know what the paperwork says." The answer hurt more than anger would have. I sat across from him. "Paperwork is not the reason you are my son. It is the reason nobody can just send me somewhere." "Julian." He pushed the repaired book toward Willa. "It's fixed." She hugged it to her chest, but her eyes remained on him. I asked Willa to choose a movie in the living room. When she left, I kept my voice low. You do not have to tell me everything tonight. But Gavin is not allowed to teach you that the court can solve this family by removing you. He was being honest. No. He was giving an adult's worst-case predictions to a grieving 15-year-old and calling the fear that followed maturity. Julian stood and carried his plate to the sink, even though he had barely eaten. If he's wrong, then nothing changes. And if he's right? He kept his back to me. Then I should be prepared. His phone lit on the counter between us. Gavin's name appeared above a new message. Julian reached for it, but I was close enough to see the words before the screen dimmed. A responsible brother prepares for every outcome. Until that moment, I had thought Lorraine and Gavin were building their case from paperwork and family prejudice. Now I understood they were building it inside my son. The rain began after dinner and settled into a steady tapping against the upstairs windows. Willa had fallen asleep early on the couch, curled beneath Peter's old blue blanket, so I carried her to bed and left the hallway light on. I was halfway back to the stairs when I heard the slow pull of packing tape from inside her room. Julian sat on the carpet beside a cardboard box. 4 of Willa's books were stacked in front of him, each one chosen with the care of someone preparing for a long absence. The first was the story she asked for during thunderstorms. The second was the book with the fox that always made her laugh. The third was the atlas, whose spine he had repaired so many times that the clear tape had turned cloudy. The last was the book Peter used to read in ridiculous animal voices until neither child could breathe from laughing. Small index cards stuck out from the covers. One said Willa liked the thunder story read slowly. Another warned not to skip the fox page. A third explained that she sometimes needed her inhaler after crying too hard. Julian had not packed toys, clothes, or anything expensive. He had packed the instructions for knowing his sister. "What are you doing?" I asked. He flinched and placed both hands over the top book. "Nothing. I was organizing." Organizing does not usually involve a shipping box. If she has to stay with Grandma, she should have the things she knows. No one has decided she is going anywhere. They're going to keep fighting until something changes. That does not make this your responsibility. His eyes stayed on the box. Uncle Gavin said cases like this can take months. He said lawyers charge for every call, every hearing, and every document. He said the longer you fight, the more likely we lose the house, or Willa has to change schools. I sat on the floor across from him. Gavin does not know our mortgage, our insurance, or what we can afford. He looked it up. He estimated it. That is not the same thing. He said estimates are how people prepare. The words sounded borrowed, polished by an adult, before being placed in my son's mouth. I reached for one of the cards, but Julian moved it beneath his palm. "Why are you teaching them how to comfort Willa?" "Because they won't know." "Then she should not live with them." For a moment, his face changed. Hope appeared so quickly that I almost missed it, but then his shoulders tightened and the hope disappeared beneath something heavier. "She'll be safer with them." "Safer from what?" His fingers pressed into the cardboard. "From losing everything because of me." The answer took the air out of the room. I wanted to pull him against me and tell him none of it was true, but I had already learned that reassurance slid off fear when fear came with numbers, documents, and adults who called themselves practical. "Show me what Gavin gave you." Julian shook his head. "It doesn't matter. It matters because you are packing your sister's life based on something an adult told you in private. He wasn't threatening me." I did not say he was. I asked to see it. He stared at me for several seconds, before reaching beneath the lowest book. A large envelope lay flat against the bottom of the box. He handed it over without looking up. Inside was a printed estimate of legal costs, broken into worst-case categories: depositions, expert evaluations, multiple hearings, appeals. Beside the total, Gavin had included the estimated market value of our house, the original mortgage amount from public records, and a note claiming that reduced income could make refinancing impossible. None of the figures reflected our life insurance, Peter's retirement account, or the actual balance on the loan. The page was not a financial analysis. It was a collection of frightening possibilities, presented as a future already decided. The next page was a brochure for a therapeutic boarding school several hours away. Someone had circled the sections about grief counseling, structured independence, and family transition. Beneath it sat a draft statement written in language no 15-year-old would use voluntarily. It said Julian believed Willa needed the stability of her biological family. It said he understood that his placement elsewhere would reduce conflict. It said no one had pressured him and that he was acting from love for his sister. His name had been practiced twice on the back of the page. "You didn't sign this," I said. "No." "Why did you practice?" "I wanted to know what it would feel like." I put the paper down carefully. "What did Lorraine tell you?" "She said if I chose it myself, nobody would have to argue that I was dangerous. She said the school wasn't punishment. It would be a responsible decision. A decision made because you believe your sister will lose her home if you stay is not voluntary. She said you would never agree, because you would think it meant failing me. She was right about one thing. I will never agree to keep Willa by sending you away." Julian looked at me for the first time. "What if that is the only way to keep her here?" "It is not. You don't know that. I know I will not negotiate one child out of this family to protect the other." His expression hardened. "Dad is dead. You work less. There are bills everywhere. Grandma filed because she thinks Willa needs stability, and everyone keeps saying I need therapy, school support, and time. Maybe the problem is not what they call me. Maybe the problem is that everything got harder after you chose me." The words came out sharper than anything he had said since Peter died. I let them remain in the room instead of rushing to correct them. "You are allowed to be angry," I said. "You are even allowed to believe things I wish you didn't believe. But you are not allowed to carry an adult plan designed to make you disappear and call it love." His eyes filled, though he did not cry. "What if leaving is still the right thing? Then I will keep protecting you until fear is no longer the person making that decision." He stood so quickly that his knee struck the box. One of the books slid onto the carpet. He picked it up, placed it back inside, and left the room without another word. I photographed every page in the envelope and called Dana from the hallway so Julian would not hear the legal language. She told me to preserve the originals, avoid writing on anything, and bring her the phone if Gavin had contacted him directly. While I was speaking, a message appeared on Julian's screen, which he had left beside the box. "If you really want to protect Willa, show me you have a transition plan." I was still staring at it when Julian returned. He saw the message and looked toward the box. Before I understood what he intended, he picked up the phone, photographed the books, and sent the image to Gavin. Under it, he typed, "I think she'll be safer with Grandma." My first instinct was to take the phone from his hand. I stopped myself. Julian needed to understand that I was protecting him, not seizing control because he had done something wrong. He read the message once, then his face crumpled with regret. "I shouldn't have sent it. You sent it because they taught you that surrender would make you good." He held the phone out to me. "Give it to Dana." That mattered more than the message itself. For the first time since the case began, Julian was not trying to solve the danger alone. He was handing responsibility back to an adult. Dana instructed me to photograph the entire conversation, export the thread, and place the phone somewhere safe. I told Julian that Lorraine and Gavin would no longer speak with him privately. Every call, visit, or message would come through me or Dana. He nodded, but his eyes returned to the box. "What if I still think going away is the right thing? Then we will keep talking until you can separate what you want from what they frightened you into wanting." After he went to his room, I began lifting the books out of the box. Beneath the last one was an index card I had not seen before. Julian had written, "If she asks for me, tell her I love her." My son had not been planning a transition. He had been preparing his sister for abandonment and calling it protection. Dana asked me to preserve every paper Gavin had given Julian, but she also warned me not to turn my son's room into a crime scene. If there were more documents, Julian needed to know why I was looking for them and to be present while I did it. That evening, I sat with him at the edge of his bed and explained that anything connected to Gavin's pressure could matter later. He nodded without argument, though the shame in his face made it clear he felt as if he had caused another problem. "There's nothing else from Uncle Gavin," he said. "Just the envelope and the messages." "I believe you. I'm asking whether there is anything you wrote down for yourself." His eyes shifted toward the bottom drawer of his desk. I waited until he crossed the room and opened it. Beneath old-school notebooks and a stack of repaired book covers was a thick white envelope. The title on the front was written in Julian's careful block letters. "Things I Still Owe Them." He tried to take it back as soon as I read the words. "That isn't about the case." "What is it about?" "It's private. I won't read it without your permission." He stood with the envelope pressed against his chest. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sat on the floor and opened it himself. The first page contained a list of expenses: braces, therapy copays, a winter coat, a used laptop Peter had bought when Julian began middle school, his 7th birthday cake, the year Peter missed work to attend appointments. Besides some items, Julian had written estimated amounts. Others had question marks because he had not known how to calculate them. Near the bottom was one entry that made my hands go cold. "Adoption lawyer." "You were 6, I said. "Why would you owe us for the lawyer who handled your adoption?" Julian stared at the page. "Because you had to pay him. We chose to pay him. That doesn't make it free. It made it our responsibility, not yours." He gave a small, exhausted laugh. "You say that because you're my mother. That is exactly why I say it." He turned another page. There were more entries, not all of them financial. Peter leaving work early when Julian had panic attacks. The time I slept on the floor beside his bed after a nightmare. A summer when we canceled a trip because his therapist advised against another major change. He had recorded acts of care, as if someone might eventually present him with a final invoice. "I wasn't planning to pay it all at once," he said. "I just didn't want to forget." "Forget what?" "What you did." The answer was simple, but the fear beneath it was not. "Were you worried we would think you had forgotten?" He rubbed his thumb over a crease in the paper. "I didn't want to become someone who took everything and acted like it belonged to him." "Who called you that?" "No one said it exactly. That was the cruelest part." Lorraine and Gavin had rarely used words direct enough to challenge. They had built the idea through smaller sentences, each one easy to excuse. "You know how lucky you are. Your parents sacrificed a great deal. Do not make them regret what they did." At Christmas, when Julian was 10, Lorraine had watched him clear the table and said, "At least this one understands what he owes." Peter had frowned and told her not to phrase it that way. Later, when Julian asked what she meant, Peter said his mother came from a different generation and that he should ignore her. I had hugged him and said, "You know you're ours." I had believed love would cancel the insult. I had never considered that asking him to ignore it meant asking him to carry it alone. "We loved you," I told him. "And we failed to stop people from making that love sound conditional. Both things can be true." His face tightened. "Did Dad ever regret adopting me?" Every answer I wanted to give arrived too quickly. "Peter loved you. Of course he never regretted you. You were his son." All of them were true, but Julian had spent too many years receiving comforting conclusions without the truth that supported them. "I never heard him say he regretted it," I said. But near the end, he asked me something I didn't understand at the time. "What?" He asked whether a child could be loved and still feel temporary. Julian looked up. "When did he say that?" "After a private conversation with Lorraine." "What was the conversation about?" "I don't know. He told me he was tired and did not want to discuss it." "Did he answer his own question?" "No." The disappointment in his face felt like another confession I had failed to give him sooner. We took the envelope to his therapist 2 days later. I expected her to suggest throwing the list away, but she said destroying it might make me feel better while taking control away from Julian. Instead, She asked whether he would allow us to write a second sentence beside each entry. Next to braces, I wrote, "Parents take care of their children's teeth." Beside birthday cake, Julian wrote nothing, so I added, "A birthday is not an invoice." When we reached therapy copays, he whispered, "That one cost a lot. Care can cost money without becoming debt," the therapist said. He allowed me to write, "Healing is not a loan." We reached the final line, "Adoption lawyer." Julian closed the folder before either of us could touch it. "I'm done." The therapist did not stop him. Neither did I. He had opened more of himself in 20 minutes than he had in the previous month, and I would not turn progress into another demand. That afternoon, Dana called and asked me to come to her office alone. Gavin's attorney had produced a video in support of his objection to my appointment as executor. The file lasted 47 seconds. Peter appeared on the screen beneath the hospice blanket. He looked thinner than I remembered, with a sheet of handwritten notes trembling in one hand. "If something happens to me," he said, "Willa must be protected. She will be the most vulnerable one." The recording ended before he explained what he meant. For several seconds, I could hear only the hum of Dana's computer. "This is not a will," she said. "It does not change the signed document." I barely heard her. "Why did he name Willa and not Julian?" "We do not know that he didn't. We know this clip stops in the middle of a recorded session." When I returned home, Julian was sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope beside him. He saw my face and asked what had happened. I should have waited until Dana and I knew more. But Lorraine's side would eventually use the video, and I would not let him hear Peter's voice for the first time in a courtroom filing. I played the clip once. Julian did not ask to hear it again. He stared at the blank screen and said, "He knew." "Knew what?" "That Willa needed protection from what would happen after he died." "He did not say from you." "He didn't have to." I wanted to argue, but the video had frightened me too. Peter had recorded something during his final month, hidden the full conversation from me, and named only our biological daughter in the part we had been given. 47 seconds should not have been enough to change what I knew about my husband. But they were enough to make me fear that, at the end of his life, Peter had looked at our 2 children and decided only one of them needed to be kept. I watched Peter's 47-second clip 3 more times in Dana's office, not because I expected the words to change, but because I kept searching for something Lorraine's lawyer might have missed. A glance, a pause, a name spoken before the recording began. The file ended so abruptly that Peter's hand was still moving when the screen went black. Dana did not speculate about what he meant. She asked practical questions instead. Who recorded this? When was it made? Who kept the original? And did Peter sign anything allowing it to be shared? I remembered the name before I remembered the day. Lena Ortiz had been Peter's hospice social worker, the woman who spoke to him without lowering her voice as if illness had made him a child. During his final month, she had offered something called a family legacy recording, a private session where patients could leave memories, apologies, or instructions for the people they loved. Peter had told me he wanted to do it alone. At the time, I had been relieved. Willa had a grief counseling appointment that afternoon, and Julian needed to finish a school project. Lorraine had volunteered to sit with Peter until Lena arrived. When I came home, a hospice tablet was gone from the coffee table, and Peter looked more exhausted than he had that morning. "How did it go?" I had asked. "Harder than I expected." I waited for more, but he closed his eyes. I told myself we had time. Dana asked whether hospice had sent me a copy. I remembered several automated messages arriving during Peter's illness, but most had gone to a separate family archive email he used for medical receipts, photographs, and documents he did not want buried in our everyday inbox. He had created it when treatment began and stored the password in a digital manager. After he died, I had opened the folders I knew existed, but I had not searched every saved account. Grief had turned administration into triage. I paid urgent bills, called the school, and submitted the will. Anything that did not demand an immediate answer remained untouched. Dana and I returned to the house that afternoon. Peter's laptop was still on the desk where he had left it, surrounded by transportation maps, prescription schedules, and a coffee mug no one had moved. I unlocked the password manager using the emergency access instructions he had placed with our insurance papers. The archive account contained hundreds of messages. Dana searched Lena's name and found one dated February 18th. The email thanked Peter for participating in the Family Legacy Recording Program. It included a secure viewing link, a consent notice, and a session length of 11 minutes and 32 seconds. My link had expired 30 days after Peter's death. A separate notification showed that a second authorized recipient had accessed and downloaded the recording the same evening it was created. Lorraine. I read her name twice. She had the full video before he died. She had access to it, Dana corrected. We still need the certified original and proof of what was stored. Why would Peter send it to her? We'll answer that after we get the file. Dana requested the consent record and asked Gavin's attorney to preserve every version in his client's possession. When they produced only the same 47-second excerpt, she sought a court order directing hospice to provide the original recording and verification of how it had been created and stored. The process took days, not months. Lena supplied a signed statement confirming that Peter had prepared notes, recorded voluntarily on a hospice tablet, and authorized the service to retain the original for 1 year. The server record confirmed the date, the full duration, and the fact that no one at hospice had edited the file. The consent form listed 2 secure recipients, Naomi Keller, Lorraine Keller. Peter had wanted both of us to hear it. 4 days before the hearing on his will, Dana called and asked me to come to her office. The certified file had been released to both sides. "Do you want me to watch it first?" she asked. No. I had already spent too many weeks allowing other people to decide which parts of my husband's words I could bear. Dana closed the blinds. Peter appeared on the screen in the same hospice bed, but the full recording began before the line about Willa. A sheet of paper rested in his hand. I recognized his handwriting in the margins, neat at the top and increasingly unsteady toward the bottom. He had not been speaking without preparation. He had known what he wanted to say. I watched until he reached a sentence that forced me to stop the video. Dana paused it without asking why. I stood, walked to the window, and pressed my fingers against the glass until the cold steadied me. What hurt was not that Peter had lied to me. It was that he had understood something about Julian before I did, and instead of telling me directly, he had left the truth inside a recording I almost never found. When I sat again, we watched the rest. Dana remained silent for several seconds after the screen went dark. Then she said, "This does not decide the child case. Judge Ellis cannot use Peter's feelings to determine who should raise Willa." I know, but it destroys their interpretation. The next morning, Gavin's attorney filed a motion asking the probate court to limit the recording to the 47 seconds they had already submitted. He described everything else as private family commentary, unrelated to my fitness to serve as executor. I stared at the filing. They have seen the full video. Why are they still continuing? Because they think the legal question protects them, Dana said. They will argue that Peter's emotional opinions do not change the will, while the excerpt still makes you appear dishonest for rejecting what they call his final instruction. But the full recording proves that was not his instruction. Yes. That is why they are asking the judge not to hear it. The strategy was colder than an outright lie. Lorraine and Gavin had not invented Peter's sentence. They had removed the explanation that gave it meaning, then relied on legal procedure to keep the rest outside the room. When I returned home, Julian was at the kitchen table repairing the atlas from Willa's box. He had removed the old tape and was aligning the torn pages before applying a new strip. The care in his hands made it difficult to breathe. "Did you find the rest?" he asked. "Yes." His fingers stopped above the page. "What did he say?" I sat across from him. "Your father did not say what they told you," he said. Relief did not reach his face. Did he say he wanted me? The question was so small that it revealed how low Julian had set the standard. He was not asking whether Peter loved him. He was asking whether his father had wanted him to remain after becoming inconvenient. He said more than that, I told him. And you deserve to hear it when you are ready, not as a weapon in somebody else's case. Why can't I hear it now? Because the court has not ruled on how it will be used, and because I will not make your father's apology responsible for holding this family together. He is not here to do the work that belongs to me. Julian looked down at the atlas. What if the judge only lets them play the short part? Then Dana will argue for the whole truth. And if the judge says no, I will still know what Peter meant. So will you, when you choose to watch it. He pressed the new tape over the spine, slowly enough to avoid a wrinkle. I don't know if I want to. You don't have to decide tonight. 2 notices arrived before dinner. The hearing on Peter's will and my appointment as executor was scheduled for June 23rd. The hearing on Lorraine's petition to remove me as Willa's guardian would take place the following morning. I placed both notices beside the certified transcript Dana had given me. Lorraine and Gavin were still trying to divide our family through 2 separate courtrooms, but the missing 10 minutes had changed the ground beneath them. For the first time since Julian packed those books, I no longer feared what Peter had believed. I feared what my son had been forced to believe before anyone allowed him to hear the rest of his father's sentence. 3 evenings before the first hearing, I found Willa standing inside Julian's room with one of the books he had packed against her chest. She had taken the Thunder story from the box and placed it in the middle of his bed. The rest of the books were still stacked beneath the window, their index cards tucked carefully between the pages. Julian looked from the book to his sister. Why did you put that there? So Grandma can't take all of them. No one is taking them tonight. I know, but if some are in your room, she won't know they're mine. Julian sat on the edge of his bed. Do you want to live with Grandma? Willa considered the question seriously. I like sleeping there when she lets me have pancakes. That wasn't what I asked. I don't want a house without your stuff. She said it while examining a loose thread on Peter's old blanket, as if the answer were too obvious to require more explanation. Julian lowered his eyes, and I saw the familiar conflict cross his face. He wanted to believe her, but believing her meant admitting that leaving would hurt the person he claimed to be protecting. Willa climbed beside him and opened the book to the Fox page. You didn't put the tape straight last time. I put it exactly where it needed to go. It has a bubble. That is because you folded the cover before it dried. They began arguing quietly over the repair, and I stayed in the doorway without interrupting. For weeks, every conversation between them had been touched by courts, money, or the possibility of separation. Their irritation with each other felt healthier than another promise of sacrifice. Erin Cole met with Willa privately the following afternoon. I drove her to the appointment and waited in the reception area with a magazine I never turned a page of. Erin had made it clear that she represented Willa, not me, and that she would not repeat every sentence my daughter said. I was grateful for the boundary, even though waiting outside a closed door while someone discussed my family required a kind of trust I did not feel prepared to give. Willa emerged 40 minutes later, carrying a sheet of stickers and looking tired. She did not speak until we were in the car. I told Erin I'm not scared when Julian is there, she said as I fastened my seatbelt. I'm scared when people talk like he won't be. I kept my eyes on the steering wheel. What did she say? She asked if I thought you would make him leave. And what did you tell her? That you said no. She looked through the passenger window. But Grandma said adults say things before judges decide. I wanted to ask exactly when Lorraine had said that, and what else she had told Willa. But Dana's warning returned to me. Do not turn every conversation into an interview. Willa needed a mother more than I needed another statement. You do not have to guess what a judge will do, I said. You only have to tell the truth about what you feel. I feel like everybody asks which house I want, but nobody asks which people I want in it. That sentence stayed with me when Dana called later that day. She had received the sections of Aaron's preliminary report that could be shared with the parties. Willa showed a stable attachment to both me and Julian. She had not described fear, intimidation, or inappropriate behavior from her brother. Removing her from our home and separating her from him would create another significant loss after Peter's death. The child welfare report was equally clear. The investigator found no substantiated neglect. Our home was safe, the school absences were consistent with Peter's hospice care and funeral, and Willa's asthma had remained medically managed. I had corrected the delayed school authorization form. The report did note that Julian had taken on too much responsibility during Peter's illness, but it also recorded that I had begun therapy, adjusted the household routine, and stopped using him as emergency childcare. They can still argue their interpretation, Dana said, but they no longer have an independent report supporting it. I expected relief. Instead, I thought of Julian hearing that the investigator had identified parentification. Even a truthful observation could become another debt in his mind. One more way he had failed by trying too hard to help. That evening, I found him at the kitchen table, with the boarding school brochure folded beneath his math homework. He moved it aside when I sat across from him. Dana received the reports, I said. No one found that Willa was unsafe here. He waited. They also found that you carried too much while Peter was sick. His mouth tightened. So they did think I was part of the problem. They thought the adults allowed you to become responsible for things that should not have been yours. I volunteered. You were 14, and watching your father disappear in front of you. Volunteering does not relieve adults of judgment. He traced the edge of the brochure. If money and court weren't part of it, I'd want to stay. I heard the condition before I heard the admission. Say it without the first part. He looked at me as though I had asked him to step onto ice he could not test. What? Forget the fees, the house, and what Lorraine wants. What do you want? His eyes filled, but he did not look away. I want to stay. There was no speech after it. No explanation of why he deserved to remain, and no promise to behave better. 4 words were all he could manage, and they were the first honest request he had made since Peter died. You are allowed to want that, I said. What if wanting it hurts Willa? Then, we deal with the consequences together. You do not remove yourself before anyone else has to feel discomfort. The settlement proposal arrived the next morning. Lorraine would withdraw her petition if I agreed that Willa would live with her during the school week for 1 year. Julian would enroll in the therapeutic boarding school Gavin had selected. I would stop alleging that either of them had manipulated him, and all parties would describe the arrangement as voluntary. Dana read the terms to me over the phone, though I could hear the anger she was trying to keep out of her voice. They are offering to stop trying to remove you as guardian, she said. If you implement the separation they wanted before filing, send the refusal. Do you want to make a counteroffer? No. There is nothing to negotiate. Lorraine called less than an hour after Dana sent my response. I almost let it go to voicemail, but Willa was at school and Julian was upstairs with his therapist on video. For once, I wanted Lorraine to hear my answer without another person softening it. You are placing an adopted teenager's needs above your biological daughter, she said. I am refusing an agreement that protects one child by removing the other. You are choosing conflict. You filed to remove me as Willa's guardian. Because you cannot see what this is doing to her. I can see exactly what it is doing. She checks whether Julian's belongings are still in the house before she goes to sleep. Lorraine was silent for a moment. Willa will adjust. That is what adults say when they want a child to absorb the cost of their decision. She ended the call without saying goodbye. That night, Julian's phone vibrated beside his plate. Gavin had sent another message, despite Dana's written demand that all contact stop. This is your last chance to do the right thing before the hearing. Julian read it once. He did not reply, delete it, or hide the screen. He held the phone across the table to me. Can you give this to Dana? The action was small, but it told me something had shifted. He was no longer trying to prove he could manage the danger alone. He was allowing me to stand between him and the adults who had trained him to mistake surrender for responsibility. On the morning before the hearings, I laid out my court clothes on the bed and checked the folders Dana had given me. Julian appeared in the doorway holding the roll of clear book tape. He placed it in my palm. "Take this. You do not have to give me anything for me to protect you." "I know." He folded my fingers around it. "I just thought your hands might need something to do." The probate hearing would begin the next morning. The hearing about Willa would follow one day later. For weeks, I had thought I needed those courtrooms to prove Julian belonged in our family. As I slipped the roll of tape into my bag, I understood the harder truth. The legal fight could protect his place in the house, but only we could teach him that staying was not something he had to earn. The probate courtroom was smaller than I expected. There were no television cameras, no rows of spectators, and no dramatic entrance for anyone carrying the truth. There were only 2 long tables, a wooden bench, and a clerk arranging files beneath fluorescent lights. Peter's original will was already in the court record. Gavin had brought a thick binder of copies and placed it in front of him as if the weight of paper could make him more entitled to my husband's life. Julian and Willa were not there. Aaron had arranged for Willa to spend the morning with a school counselor, and Julian had agreed to attend class as long as Dana called me the moment the hearing ended. I had refused to let either child sit behind me while adults transformed their grief into evidence. The roll of book tape Julian had given me rested inside my bag. I touched it once before Judge Ellis entered, then forced my hands onto the table. The judge began by identifying the questions before her. Peter's will had to be admitted to probate, and the court had to decide whether I should be appointed executor as he had directed. Gavin was asking the court to reject Peter's nomination and appoint him instead. His attorney stood first. He did not argue that the will was forged or improperly witnessed. He admitted that Peter had signed it in 2022 before 2 independent witnesses. Instead, he said circumstances had changed during Peter's final illness. Mr. Keller recorded a final instruction concerning the protection of his biological daughter, he said. Mrs. Keller concealed that instruction, refused the support of Peter's family, and demonstrated a conflict between her duties to the estate and her personal attachment to her adopted son. The words were delivered calmly enough to sound reasonable. Dana rose. The document nominates Naomi Keller as executor. The recording is not a will, a codicil, or a valid amendment. Petitioners are using a private family statement to avoid the written choice Peter made. Gavin's lawyer smiled politely. We are not claiming the video amends the will. We are offering it as evidence of Mrs. Keller's fitness and credibility. Judge Ellis looked toward him. Then establish the relevance without arguing that the recording changed the testamentary document. He nodded and moved to the photograph. The image of Willa's box appeared on the courtroom screen. I saw the 4 books, the pale index cards, and the edge of Julian's hand at the bottom of the frame. For a moment I was back in her bedroom, listening to my son explain why his sister would be safer with people who did not know how to comfort her. The attorney enlarged Julian's message beneath the photograph. I think she'll be safer with Grandma. Julian Keller prepared the child's belongings and communicated his belief directly to my client, he said. No one forced him to develop a transition plan. His actions demonstrate that even the adolescent at the center of this conflict understood Willa required greater stability. Dana did not object to the message itself. The image had come from Gavin's phone, and the full thread had already been authenticated. Instead, she asked that the preceding messages be displayed. The screen changed. Gavin's words appeared above Julian's photograph. If you really want to protect Willa, show me you have a transition plan. Below that were his references to legal costs, the house, and the possibility that Willa would lose her school. Dana introduced the worst-case financial sheet and the statement Gavin had prepared for Julian to sign. She approached the witness table after Gavin was sworn in. You gave a 15-year-old an estimate suggesting his mother could lose her home if litigation continued. I gave him information. You did not know Naomi Keller's actual mortgage balance. I used public records. You did not know the amount of Peter's life insurance. No. You did not know the beneficiary designation on his retirement account. No. You did not know her current legal agreement with counsel. Gavin's jaw tightened. The numbers were projections. Yet you presented them to a grieving child, without labeling them as speculative. I believed he was mature enough to understand. Dana lifted the draft statement. Mature enough to make his own decision? Yes. Then why did you write the decision for him? Gavin looked toward his lawyer before answering. We provided language so the court would understand what he meant. He had not yet made the statement. He had expressed concern for his sister. After you told him his presence could cost her a home. That is not what I said. Dana directed the clerk to the message, where Gavin had written that a responsible brother prepared for every outcome. She did not raise her voice or accuse him of threatening Julian. She only placed his own words beside the paper he wanted my son to sign. Gavin's attorney stood before Dana could ask another question. The witness has explained his intent. The central issue remains what Peter Keller wanted before his death. Judge Ellis allowed him to proceed. He introduced the 47-second video and argued that Peter's statement proved I had ignored a final request concerning Willa. The certified full recording had been disclosed to both sides 4 days earlier, but the attorney had filed a motion asking the court to limit what could be played. He described the remaining minutes as an emotional family discussion, unrelated to my qualifications as executor. When the courtroom monitor lit, he smiled. Peter appeared beneath the hospice blanket. The sight of him still struck me physically. His cheeks were hollow, and a page of handwritten notes trembled in his left hand. If something happens to me, Peter said, Willa must be protected. She will be the most vulnerable one. The recording stopped. The frozen image remained on the screen, while Gavin's attorney turned toward Judge Ellis. Peter Keller understood that his biological daughter would need protection after his death. Mrs. Keller rejected his family's assistance and concealed the recording until it was obtained through these proceedings. Whatever affection she has for Julian, her judgment is compromised by her refusal to recognize Peter's final concern. I felt the roll of book tape through the fabric of my bag. Julian had given it to me because he thought my hands might need something to do. I kept them still. Dana stood. Your Honor, the recording session lasted 11 minutes and 32 seconds. Petitioners selected 47 seconds from the middle of Peter's answer and now ask the court to determine its meaning without hearing his explanation. The opposing attorney replied that the rest contained private accusations, emotional commentary, and statements irrelevant to the probate questions. Judge Ellis looked at the paused image of Peter. You offered this excerpt to establish both meaning and credibility. Yes, Your Honor. Then the court cannot evaluate that meaning while excluding the context in which the statement was made. He tried again. The additional material is prejudicial. Prejudice arising from context is not the same as unfair prejudice. The judge denied his motion and instructed the clerk to play the complete portion of Peter's answer. Across the aisle, Lorraine folded her hands in her lap. Gavin leaned toward his attorney and whispered something I could not hear. The smile remained on the lawyer's face, but it had become rigid, held there by effort rather than confidence. The screen went dark for a moment, then Peter appeared again. This time the recording began several minutes earlier. Lena's voice could be heard asking whether there was anything he wanted his family to understand before making decisions for the children. Peter looked down at the notes he had prepared. He closed his eyes, drew a careful breath, and raised his face toward the camera. Before anyone decides where Willa belongs, he said, I need to admit what I taught Julian by refusing to confront my own family. The attorney across the aisle stopped smiling. Peter looked into the camera, then down at the notes in his hand. I loved Julian from the day we brought him home, he said. But love did not stop him from feeling temporary, and I made that worse every time I asked him to ignore what my family said. My throat tightened. Peter paused to catch his breath. When my mother called him lucky, grateful, or difficult, I told him she came from another generation. When Gavin joked about what Julian owed us, I told my son not to take it personally. I thought I was keeping peace between adults. What I taught him was that everyone else's comfort mattered more than his place in our family. I pressed my hand against the roll of book tape inside my bag. Peter had been speaking about himself, but I heard my own voice in every confession. I had told Julian he was ours, then allowed the people questioning that truth to return for dinner, birthdays, and holidays. We had loved him without protecting the meaning of that love. Peter lifted the page closer to his face. A few weeks ago, my mother offered to pay the medical debt from my treatment and cover 6 months of the mortgage. She said Willa could live with her after I was gone, and Julian could attend a boarding school with counseling. Across the aisle, Lorraine's head rose sharply. Peter continued. I asked her which child she believed she was protecting. She said, "The one who carries your family." Lorraine closed her eyes. I refused, Peter said. I should have told Naomi that day. I didn't because I was ashamed that my silence had allowed my mother to believe she could make that offer. I was tired, and I convinced myself recording the answer would be enough. His breathing became uneven. Lena's voice asked whether he needed to stop. Peter shook his head. When I say Willa will be the most vulnerable one, I do not mean she needs protection from Julian. I mean my family will call her my blood and try to make her believe loving her brother is disloyal to me. They will offer her a version of family that requires Julian to disappear. Images moved through my mind as he spoke. Julian checking Willa's inhaler, repairing the Fox book, making the owl voice long after Peter was too weak to read. They know Julian, Peter said. They know he will leave if he believes leaving protects his sister. He will call it maturity. He will call it gratitude. He will call it his choice. Peter looked directly into the camera. If Julian says Willa will be safer without him, don't call it a choice. Ask who taught him that the easiest child is the child people keep. The courtroom had become so quiet that I could hear the air vent above the clerk's desk. Peter lowered his notes, but he was not finished. Julian, if you ever see this, you never owed us for becoming ours. The lawyer, the therapy, the shoes, the birthdays, all of it was our responsibility. I am sorry I let anyone make those things sound like a bill. The video ended with Peter looking toward Lena instead of the camera, as if he had used the last of his strength on the words themselves. No one moved immediately. Gavin's attorney stood first. His voice had lost the confidence it carried when the short clip played. Your Honor, the additional statements are emotional and do not constitute testamentary instructions. Dana rose beside me. We agree. The recording does not amend the will. It does, however, destroy the allegation that Naomi concealed Peter's wish to separate Willa from Julian. Judge Ellis reviewed the documents before her. She did not deliver a speech about family or adoption. She ruled on the questions the law had placed in front of her. Peter's will had been properly executed. It named me executor. Gavin had not shown that I was unfit, dishonest, or acting against the estate. The video did not change the will, and the excerpt offered by his side had presented Peter's meaning without the explanation he had deliberately recorded. Judge Ellis admitted the will and appointed me executor. Gavin's objection was denied. He stared at the binder in front of him while the clerk collected the exhibits. Lorraine did not look at me. Winning did not feel like triumph. Peter had chosen me in writing years earlier, and I had spent weeks defending that choice because his family believed one edited sentence could replace the whole man. The next morning, Dana and I entered a different courtroom before Judge Ward. This time, the question was not who would administer Peter's estate. It was whether I should remain Willa's guardian. Lorraine's attorney tried to return to the same story. I was grieving. Julian had carried too much responsibility. Willa needed biological stability, but the independent reports no longer supported the conclusion he wanted. The child welfare investigation found no neglect. Willa's asthma had remained medically managed. Her school absences matched Peter's final illness and funeral. The investigator acknowledged that Julian had taken on too much, but also documented that I had recognized the problem, arranged therapy, and stopped relying on him as emergency childcare. Erin Cole told the court that Willa did not fear her brother. She feared losing him. She described my daughter's wishes in language that still sounded like an 8-year-old, not a witness trained by adults. Willa wanted to live at home. She wanted Julian's belongings to remain in the house. She did not understand why people kept describing Peter's family as if her brother stood outside it. Dana introduced Gavin's messages, the financial projections, and the statement prepared for Julian to sign. The full recording and Peter's consent form were already part of the shared evidence record. Judge Ward asked Lorraine why protecting Willa required separating her from her legal brother. Lorraine sat straight in the witness chair. Because grief has made Naomi unable to recognize the difference between emotional attachment and biological responsibility. What responsibility does biology create that adoption does not? The judge asked. Lorraine hesitated. Willa carries Peter's family. There it was again. Not concern about school attendance, asthma, or supervision. The belief beneath every document. Judge Ward said the evidence did not clearly and convincingly show that I had denied Willa necessary care, guidance, or control. The reports showed a safe home, appropriate medical care, and a child whose greatest emotional risk would come from another forced loss. The petition to remove me as guardian was denied. The request for temporary custody was denied again. No visitation order was granted to Lorraine. Outside the courtroom, she approached before Dana could guide us toward the elevators. Willa stood beside me, holding my hand. Julian was waiting at home with his therapist, exactly where he had chosen to be. Lorraine looked at Willa. I only wanted to preserve what was left of your father. Willa's fingers tightened around mine. You said I could have Dad's family, she said. Julian is Dad's family. Lorraine opened her mouth, but Willa turned away before she answered. I did not ask my daughter to hug her grandmother. I did not promise Lorraine future visits. As Willa's sole guardian, I told Dana that all communication would go through her office for the next 90 days. After that, contact would depend on what was safe for both children, not on what Lorraine believed blood entitled her to receive. When we reached the parking lot, I called Julian. He answered. Before the first ring finished, Did Dad say I should stay? I looked at Willa beside me and the courthouse behind us. He said you should never have been made to ask. Julian was quiet for several seconds. Then he asked whether Willa was coming home. We both are. The courts had kept our family legally intact. They had not yet taught my son that home was not a contract with an exit clause. That work would begin after we walked through our own front door. By August, our house had become quiet in a way that no longer frightened me. The court notices were filed, Dana's calls came less often, and Willa had stopped checking the hallway each morning to see whether Julian's bedroom door was open. We were not healed, but our days had begun to belong to us again. The box of books remained beneath Willa's window for almost 6 weeks. I never asked Julian to unpack it. I had learned that even a gentle request could become another task he believed he had to complete correctly. The books waited until one Saturday evening when Willa dragged the box into the hallway and began removing them herself. She carried the Thunder story into Julian's room and placed it on his bed. Then she brought the atlas, the fox book, and the story Peter used to read in animal voices. Julian watched from his desk without helping. Where do these go? She asked. Wherever you want. She frowned. That is not an answer. It means I don't care. Willa studied him, then placed the book he disliked most directly on his pillow. Then this one goes where your face sleeps. Julian stared at it before a laugh escaped him. Absolutely not. You said anywhere. I made a mistake. For the next 20 minutes, they argued over which books belonged in her room and which ones could remain on his shelf. Willa accused him of organizing by height instead of importance. Julian told her importance was not a measurable category. Their voices moved through the hallway with the ordinary irritation of siblings who expected to wake up in the same house the next morning. I stood in the kitchen and let them argue. Lorraine and Gavin had lost both cases. Gavin was not appointed executor, and neither of them received authority over Willa. They paid their own legal fees, and I stopped all direct contact with the children. Any message had to pass through Dana's office for 90 days. Lorraine sent 3 letters during that time. The first explained her intentions. The second blamed grief. The third used the word apology without naming what she had done. Willa did not ask to read them. Julian kept his sealed in a desk drawer and told me he would decide later. I did not push either child toward forgiveness. Forgiveness offered to make adults comfortable would have repeated the same mistake Peter and I had made for years. Gavin received the tools Peter had left him because that was what the will required. Lorraine received the watch and family album named in the document. I did not withhold either item to punish them. The probate estate was modest, and most of Peter's financial protections had passed directly to me outside it. I paid the remaining medical bills, transferred the car title, and completed the reports Dana helped me prepare. Executing Peter's will did not require me to like his family. It required me to respect the choices he had placed in writing. I wanted the record to show that I had done exactly what he trusted me to do, even after the people challenging me had not shown us the same integrity. The harder work continued in Julian's therapist's office. The envelope titled "Things I Still Owe Them" lay open on the table between us. Julian had agreed to revisit it, though he kept one hand on the folder as if someone might take it away. Beside braces, we wrote, care. Beside therapy copays, we wrote, healing is not a loan. Beside birthday cake, Julian wrote, not an invoice. He gave a small smile after writing that one. It was the first time he had touched the list without looking ashamed. The final entry remained unchanged. Adoption lawyer. I asked whether I could write beside it. Julian hesitated, then nodded. I wrote, adoption created our responsibility, not your debt. He read the sentence twice. You always say I was chosen, he said. I thought that word made you feel wanted. It sounds like something people can do again. What do you mean? If you can choose someone, you can decide later that you chose wrong. I felt the old instinct to reassure him immediately, but reassurance was not the same as listening. What word would feel better? I asked. He looked at the page for a long time. Family. Why family? It doesn't sound like a contest. The therapist asked whether he wanted to replace the word adoption on the list. Julian shook his head. He was not ready to erase the history that had shaped him. Instead, he crossed out lawyer and wrote family beneath it. That was enough for one day. A week later, I found one of Julian's science fiction novels on the laundry room shelf. A bottle of detergent had leaked beside it, soaking the lower half of the cover. The pages had dried in stiff waves, and the ink had bled around the edges. When I asked which edition he wanted as a replacement, he answered without looking up from his homework. I don't need another one. It is ruined. I already read it. That was not my question. He glanced toward me, and I recognized the same uncertainty I had seen in the shoe store months earlier. Wanting something still felt dangerous because wanting created cost. Willa climbed onto the chair beside him. You bought me 3 new books when I wrecked mine. One was your birthday present. You still replaced it. That was different. Because you like me more than you like yourself? Julian looked offended. That is not what I said. It is what your face said. He opened the bookstore website, mostly to prove her wrong. Several editions appeared on the screen. He moved past the cheapest paperback and paused over a hardback version with a small fox printed in one corner of the cover. That one looks good, I said. It costs more. I can see the price. He studied the image, then looked at me. That one. If that's okay. I did not praise him for asking. I did not tell him how proud I was, or turn the moment into evidence that therapy was working. A child should not receive applause every time he trusts his mother to care for him. Okay, I said. The book arrived 4 days later. Julian opened the package at the kitchen table, checked the cover for damage, and carried it to the living room. He did not ask whether he needed to do anything in return. That evening, he sat on the sofa reading it. Willa lay beside him with the Thunder story open across her knees, but she did not ask him to read for her. I worked at the dining table, while the dishwasher ran, and summer rain touched the windows. No one was preparing to leave. No one was proving that they deserved to stay. Julian had spent almost 9 years trying to earn a place we had already promised him. I could not erase every day we had allowed him to doubt it. But the night he asked for one book, and trusted that the answer would not become a debt, our home finally began to mean what we had always said it meant.